Hello everyone and welcome to this video. So today I'm going to be doing a short but sweet video looking at the top 5 tarot decks that I would recommend for beginners. So these are decks that I have worked with myself and from my extensive collection of almost 200 decks now. And these are really the decks that I feel like combine the traditional knowledge of the tarot, make it easy for interpretation, and you can form an easy connection with. So without further ado, let's get into deck number 1. So I don't think you can have a top 5 tarot deck list and not have the traditional Rider Waite deck. So this is actually the Radiant Rider Waite deck. You can see this is very old. It was the very first deck that I originally purchased, and you can see that in the cards as well because they're quite worn. They've traveled with me a lot over the years. But the reason why I've added this in is because majority of decks today are based off of this form of tarot. There is a lot more modern ones coming out that kind of go into their own interpretations and taking the tarot and growing it, but a good chunk of the tarot decks really do focus on the interpretations from the Rider Waite deck. So I do feel like it's kind of imperative to have at least a base understanding and recognition of the cards, depending on the type of tarot readings you're doing as well. If you're wanting to go into the symbolism, to archetypes, mysticism, you really do need to understand this tarot deck. Most of the time you'll see that it doesn't actually come with a whole lot of information. So the deck does have, just in this box for example, just a really small thin book. So I would recommend, if you're going to get your traditional deck, pick up another book as well that is going to help you to interpret the cards and understand the cards and their basic meanings. But again, I do feel like this kind of is your building block on understanding every other deck, because the meanings really essentially come from this deck and when this one was created. So definite must in your collection. So deck number 2 is an interesting one. I kind of ummed and ahed about putting this one in because it's not necessarily a traditional deck in the sense of the imagery, but what I really like about this one is the ease and the simplicity of understanding the cards, and that is the Spirit Song tarot deck. And my reasoning for putting this one in is because the cards themselves, if I don't drop them everywhere, the cards themselves actually have prompt words on the bottom here. And to me, I feel like if you're learning, this is a really great way, just like oracle cards tend to have prompt words or descriptions of some sort, this is a really great way to start to understand what the tarot card itself means when you're learning. So the imagery itself is obviously, it's animals. It is called the Spirit Song Tarot, so this is more about spiritual kind of energies, working with the animal kingdom. So the imagery that you see is not quite going to be in alignment with what traditional tarot is, but the prompt words I feel like are invaluable and make this a really simple deck, an easy deck to work with, plus the imagery is also beautiful as well. But when you're learning and starting out, there's 78 cards in a deck, so it can be quite hard to, when you're coming from that logical space, and when we're all learning, we all come from that logical sense of wanting to know what every card specifically means. So when you're coming from that energy, it's really nice to have a couple of little words on the bottom just to give you that prompt in understanding what the energy is of that card, so you can help to build the message and the overall energy of the entire reading. So deck number 3, again, this was one that I kind of ummed and ahed about putting into the selection, but the reason being I found that it was a really good deck that brings in the modern concepts of the tarot while sticking to the traditional meanings as well, and that is the Everyday Witch Tarot. And one of the reasons why I feel like this is a really great deck to use is because of the guidebook. The imagery itself it still kind of stays in alignment, as you can see, with some of the cards themselves. I mean, here's the Magician here, so there is a lot of similarities to the traditional meanings of the tarot. It's got a bit more of a witchy modern spin on it, but the most valuable aspect that I find with this deck is actually the guidebook itself. As you can see, it's quite detailed and thick. You know, it's in color. There's a lot of information that comes with it as well, and I know when we're starting out in reading the tarot, a lot of people can feel intimidated and feel like if they have to rely on the guidebook that they're not intuitive, or they're not psychic, or they don't know how to read the cards. I personally have been reading tarot since I was 16 years old, and I still love to read the guidebooks. The guidebooks are an essential connection to that particular deck. My personal belief has always been that when you're purchasing a deck, you're not only purchasing a method of divination or a tool of divination, you're actually buying a creation of the artist, of the writer, and their interpretation on how they understand the tarot themselves and how they are channeling the messages of their cards. So having a really good guidebook is imperative to understand how they are wanting that imagery to be pushed across. It's understanding the story of how they created the deck, and you always find amazing interpretations. Sometimes it's just one different interpretation, one sentence of a card that makes it click for you. So working with the guidebook is a really great way of connecting with your cards and connecting with the deck and understanding the energies of the deck. And if you've got a nice thick detailed guidebook, this obviously is going to give you a bit of a leg up in understanding it. And I do feel like the messages in this one, it also leaves sections for notes as well if you feel like you want to detail these kind of things, but it gives so much information on there. It kind of gives you know, a little prompt word. It gives information on the overall message of the card and how to kind of interpret it into a reading as well. So I do feel like this is the reason why it's such a great deck to have in your toolkit, so to speak, because we are working with modern energies, so you kind of want a slight modern spin on the tarot as well that still has the traditional meanings at heart in the tarot deck. So deck number 4 is a slight bit of bias from myself, because this is one of the decks that I have formed one of the strongest connections with and worked with the most, and I really felt like this is the deck that built my personal practice and built my personal understanding of the cards and gave a lot of depth as well. So there is a bit of a slight bias here, but I do feel like as well it's a really great all-round deck and overall energy. It still has a bit more of a modern spin to it. It is a bit more themed because this is the Green Witch Tarot, and it does have that witchy kind of theme to it, but it's more natural. So the imagery itself isn't in the same alignment as the Everyday Witch Tarot, which is emphasizing that witch kind of energy with the witch hats and things like that, or like the broomsticks and stuff, whereas this one's a lot more nature orientated and nature based. So I do feel like this deck really deepens that connection to the unseen world. It still sticks to the traditional meanings of the cards. So, you know, we have the Ace of Swords here, for example. You can see that it's got more of that nature kind of base to it. But even though it sticks to the traditional meanings, it brings in a lot more I feel like it brings in a lot more inner inquiries and depth, and this is one that I worked with personally for myself for quite some time before I started using the deck to read for other people. The other thing I really love about this one is, again, it has a really nice thick guidebook. It's not color, it is only black and white, this one, but it has a really, really in-depth guidebook, and even more so in some ways in terms of the messages than what the Everyday Witch Tarot had. So you can see, for example, there's a lot of depth and detail here in understanding the scene that is being played out in the card itself. This goes into the overall energies of what this card represents, the messages behind it, and not only that, this actually brings in the herbal component as well. So it will talk about the particular herbs that are in the card. This is a green tarot deck, obviously, so it talks about that aspect with nature. So if you're wanting to build your practice with working with something else, not just the tarot, this really does bring in those magical qualities to it. And it will also talk about any animals and things like that if it's in there as well. And the other reason why I really love this is because if you don't want to read the entire in-depth aspect, it does have at the end the meaning of the card, just a brief meaning, and it also has the reversal meanings, and it also has prompt words, so you can learn just single words that can help to prompt the meanings and the messages of this card. So again, this was one that I found I really built the strongest connection with and found the most depth in understanding the tarot, especially from a more modern perspective, because when we look at the traditional meanings of the Rider-Waite deck, for example, they are heavily rooted in Christianity and those medieval kind of concepts, which can be a little bit off-putting if you're not into that kind of side of things, or you know, it can make a lot of the darker cards like death or the devil seem more intimidating than what they actually are. Whereas these kind of more modern decks can really bring in an additional layer that helps you to see the card from a very of a higher perspective, and from a magical perspective and a more holistic approach. So deck number 5 is probably the deck that I learnt with when I was younger. This I actually don't know if you can get the deck as it is that I have it, because I bought it so many years ago. I do know that it is still in existence, because I have seen a few tarot readers use the deck itself. However, I don't know if it's in this same format, so I'm sorry if you can't find it, but it's called the Instant Tarot Reader. Now you can see this is really old school, like it's got a cardboard sort of cutout, and it just slides in and out, but this deck is the deck that I learned to use, because even though the Rider-Waite deck was the very first deck that I purchased, I didn't form a connection with it, and I did have a book that I bought to help me understand it, but I just came from too much of a logical perspective and just didn't connect to the messages at all. Whereas this deck, when I started working with this deck, I found I really understood how it can interconnect, and I started understanding the messages themselves. So it's this is like a mini version, I believe, so it's like in just a cardboard cutout, and there's, you can see the cards are quite small. The imagery itself I could take or leave. It's not, I wasn't overly that drawn to the imagery, because it's not really traditional in any way, shape or form. So if you're going based on the cards themselves, you might find it a little bit more difficult to understand the imagery, but what I really feel is valuable for this one is the guidebook. This is a hardcover version. Again, I don't know if you can find it in this format anymore, but it's called the Instant Tarot Reader because this lays it out for you so simplistically. So for example, based on a Celtic cross, which is a traditional reading format, when you go to the actual card, so we can see here, you know, the Sun card, for example, when you go to this card, it shows you how it can be interpreted in each position on the Celtic cross. So it lays it out in a very, very easy to understand format, because obviously the card can have a slightly different meaning depending on where it is in your spread. So this deck and this guidebook was crucial in my understanding of how each card kind of interconnects and is played out in reading a spread. It does have suggestions for questions and things like that. Like, this is really a deck and a guidebook that was created for someone who's never worked with the tarot before to be able to pick up the deck. And you don't have to use this deck. You could use this in combination with the Waite deck, for example. It's the guidebook that is the most valuable thing here. And you can use this in any kind of deck and really understand how it connects, how to work with the tarot itself, and how to come from a place of higher perspective without feeling like you need to memorize everything. The more you work with it, the more you understand it. It just cements these meanings in your mind. So this would have to be my number one best recommended deck for someone who's a beginner, more so that guidebook. So I do know the deck is in existence. Again, I'm not sure if it's in this version though. So if you can find it, absolutely life-changing in terms of interpretations. For myself anyway, that's my personal experience. So I wanted to add a little bonus one in. I mean, I could talk about all my different tarot decks and how good they all are, because I personally believe ultimately any tarot deck you get is going to be one that you can build on and learn from and understand from, especially if you get decks that are with good guidebooks as well. But I wanted to add this deck in, one, because I think it's a really great connection into knowledge, or I suppose the imagination of a lot of modern people today, because it was so prominent in our mindsets, but also because I feel like out of all of the quirky kind of decks, or gimmicky decks, I suppose you could say, the meanings and the ways that it worked with the archetypes of the characters in the tarot was so beautifully done. And the deck is the Game of Thrones Tarot. You know, I'm sure there's plenty of people out there who have never seen Game of Thrones, and that's okay. You could still use this deck if you've never seen Game of Thrones. I do want to point out, first of all, that this is not a soft deck. This is one that does come through, I see it as a more masculine energy deck. It can be quite brutal at times, but what I love about this deck is how the creator of the deck, so it's done in conjunction with HBO, but the person who wrote the guidebook really encompassed the meanings of the cards and combined it with aspects within the stories of the characters in Game of Thrones. So the guidebook is actually really quite small. It looks like a nice little traditional book. It is a hardcover, so it's quite small in terms of the, if you can see, the text, but it does have the pictures and stuff. It's really great because it does talk about the key meanings of the card. It talks about who the card is represented by, and the character, and connecting in aspects as to why that character is represented. And then it talks about the upright meaning and the reversal meaning as well, adding in like a few extra little details here and there. And I just feel like it was just so beautifully done, and magically done, that really stayed true to the characters but also stayed true to the tarot as well. The imagery is absolutely stunning, and the artistry really shows the characters, and it really gives it that sort of dark, gothic kind of feel to what the tarot is, but it is quite intimidating. So for example, you know, there's the Hanged Man. It's a very intimidating deck because if you've seen Game of Thrones is not a pretty show. It's not full of unicorns and fluff. and it does stay true to that energy. So I wanted to add that in as a little bonus for those of you who want something that's like a little bit gimmicky, but still stays true to the meanings of the tarot and builds a beautiful connection to the cards and understanding the archetypes with something that you can relate to, especially if you've seen the TV series or read the books. It gives you a great ability to cross over the characters and their archetypes with understanding the archetype and the meaning of the tarot card. So that brings me to the end. Let me know if you guys have got any of these decks or if you've had a different connection with these decks. I'd love to know. But yes, I hope you enjoyed this. I hope this has given you some food for thought, and I will see you all in the next video. Take care.